Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Phelps. I'm the Executive Director here for TMAC, Transportation Management Association of Chester County. And I welcome all of you to our first Lunch and Learn here, Building Better Bus Stops. It is a pleasure to have Natasha Manbeck with us from McMahon. Natasha has been working with TMAC for a number of years back in her county days. And so she's been always a guiding force for me personally when we look at transportation issues. So hopefully, through today's events, the work that she's been doing with PennDOT and PPTA, that you will learn more about some of the guidance that PennDOT has approved here for some bus stop design as we look at our communities and serving our communities at whole. With that, Natasha, the floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Tim and John and the entire team at TMAC. And it is great to see so many familiar faces. So good afternoon, everyone, as we approach the noon hour. As Tim says, I'm Natasha Manbeck with McMahon Associates, and I know many of you from my work in Chester County on a variety of transportation plans and municipal projects. But I'm here today to talk about the Building Better Bus Stops Guide, which McMahon helped to develop for PennDOT and PPTA. The presentation today, it is full. And so there's a lot of information, but really this just scratches the surface of what's in the full guide. I'm going to send out in the chat a link to the PPTA website where you can get the full guide, and I'll send out a couple of other links as we go forward. I have been on somewhat of a road show to present this Building Better Bus Stops guide across the state. And so if anyone has already seen this presentation, I'm sorry, it's about the same, but you might pick up something new. I'd also like to recognize that we have at least one other bus stop expert on the line. Mark Castle from SEPTA is part of the presentation. He was instrumental in development of the Building Better Bus Stops guide, and he's available to help answer questions, particularly that are SEPTA specific. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. Okay, and the presentation, I believe, will be made available on TMAC's website or to the participants. It has a lot of hyperlinks to some key references. So I want to start by sharing just a little bit of background about the Building Better Bus Stops resource guide. Over the past couple of years, there's been increasing interest and need for proactive bus stop planning. A lot of transit agencies have undertaken specific initiatives to better coordinate transit and land use. Agencies like SEPTA and the Port Authority have developed their own bus stop design guidelines. And I would like to preface this presentation and say that since Chester County is within SEPTA's service area, SEPTA's bus stop design guidelines should really be one of your first stops when you have questions about bus stop design. But as you'll see in the presentation, the Building Better Bus Stops Guide does have some planning resources that aren't covered in SEPTA's guide, and it does have a focus on more rural and suburban bus stops, which also were not necessarily a focus of SEPTA's guide. So there is a little bit of information in the bus stop guide beyond SEPTA's resource. In addition, there's been a lot of municipal interest in bus stops, and particularly how to improve bus stops as part of land development projects. So while there's been all this increasing interest, there is a lot of limited bus stop guidance. Particularly in Pennsylvania, there's over 34 different agencies that operate fixed route service throughout the state, and really only a couple had bus stop design guidelines available. So everyone else was borrowing SEPTA's, I would say. And many of the guides that are available both within the state and across the country are focused on much more urban contexts. And so there was this gap of how can we support bus stop planning and better bus stop design for suburban and rural communities in Pennsylvania? If everyone can mute themselves, thanks. So PennDOT and PPTA partnered to develop this guide. The purpose of it is to first and foremost consider transit upfront. Far too often we hear stories of, let's say, a major warehouse being developed and then having difficulty getting employees to their job site. And they call on the transit agency and say, can you serve this site? That conversation needs to happen upfront as part of the planning process. And transit, and particularly bus service and bus stops, should be considered as part of land development approvals. The other purpose of the guide, and you'll hear this throughout my presentation, is the importance of partnership and promoting partnerships between the various entities that are involved with bus stops. One of our goals with the guide was to educate planners and engineers and municipal representatives, and that's really part of the Lunch and Learn today. And we hope that the guide has some of the best practices and reflects those from both the state and federal requirements. So the guide was developed over the course of 2020, and it included a technical advisory committee, and Mark Castle from SEPTA was part of that committee. In addition, we did outreach to a number of professional organizations and other stakeholder groups. We conducted some national research, and the guide is now complete, and it's available on PPTA's website as well as PennDOT's website. So before I launch into what's included in the guide, just a quick overview is that it is resources, tools, and best practices. It is not requirements. It does not replace other design requirements. I will note that PennDOT is in the process of updating their design manual, and we are kind of waiting for the transit facilities chapter to be released. It covers planning and design, particularly for fixed route bus stops, but some of the treatments and strategies might be appropriate for other types of bus or transit service, such as paratransit. And I already mentioned we focused on particularly suburban and rural areas, but the planning and policy component is really applicable across the state. So, you may recognize one or more of the bus stops on this slide. There is a Chester County one here. And many of the bus stops in Pennsylvania currently look like these images. There's simply a sign on the side of the road, which are sometimes hard to find, so I have to circle them on the picture. They lack sidewalks and crosswalks, and it makes it difficult for people to safely walk to or from the bus stop. There's often very limited space or supportive infrastructure for waiting passengers. However, we know that enhanced bus stops are relatively low cost, and they can have a significant impact on safety, on ridership, and on transit operations. So the resource guide hopefully gives some solutions to solve these common challenges with bus stops. I think one of the issues that I've encountered recently is that bus stops are really challenging. They seem so simple, but when you go and start to try to make bus stop improvements and enhancements, it becomes very difficult. One of the challenges is that each stop or each location may have different requirements in place. And so it's hard for anyone involved with bus stops to know what are the requirements and what are the steps. It depends on the location. Each municipality may have different zoning or other ordinance requirements or requirements for building permits. It depends on the type of improvements. If the improvements include a shelter, you may have to involve PennDOT or a advertising agency. It might depend on the funding source. If you're using federal funds, you may have to go through NEPA, and including Section 106 coordination for historic resources. So it's hard, I think, for all of us, whether you're a municipal representative, a designer, a planner, engineer, to know all of these different requirements and what you might encounter when you're trying to make a bus stop improvement. So this is really a call for all the creative minds. If you want a challenge, start working on bus stops. One of the key other both challenges and opportunities is that bus stops require partnership. There's a village that's involved. And the interagency coordination and partnerships are what is critical to having successful planning and design of bus stops. So municipalities control land use, transit agencies operate service, PennDOT provides funding, MPOs and RPOs do long-range planning and programming of federal and state funds. So everyone kind of has a role to play, and it's important to understand what those various roles are and how everyone can work together for improving bus stops. So the rest of my presentation will give a quick overview of the resource guide. It is organized into 3 chapters. Part 1 is planning and policy resources. Part 2 is design resources. Part 3 is typologies. And for everyone who needs the Reader's Digest quick version, there's a 10-page quick reference. That's a brief summary, and that can be a great tool if you want to share this document with municipal or other elected officials or others that maybe don't work on bus stops on a daily basis. So I'm first going to start with part 1, which is the planning and policy resources. So this part is particularly geared towards municipalities, transit agencies, MPOs, RPOs, and planners. But if you're a traffic engineer on the call, don't fall asleep. There are planning elements that are critical for TIS's development of transportation impact statements or studies, as well as reviewing land developments, which you may do on behalf of a municipality. So transit is heavily influenced by many aspects of land use, including density and design. And municipalities, as the ones that control land use in Pennsylvania, have a really key role to play to encourage development and design that can foster public transportation and provide a number of community benefits related to public transit. So there are a number of opportunities for municipalities to incorporate transit into their fundamental plans and ordinances, such as the comprehensive plan, zoning ordinances, SALDO, and the official map. The resource guide highlights some key steps for incorporating transit into municipal plans. And I think one thing to note, it's at every step in the planning process. So it starts when you're evaluating existing conditions and knowing both where you have existing routes and stops, to also knowing where you have potential transit generators or communities that might need transit. The next phase in planning is often looking at future needs and conditions. And again, thinking about how land use and demographic trends might change your need for transit. And lastly, incorporating transit into some of the recommendations included in the plan. The resource guide summarizes some of the best practices for transit supportive land use. This includes concepts such as focusing growth along transit corridors, requiring pedestrian networks within a site, and reducing parking minimums to encourage transit ridership. The image on the left shows how development, land use, and patterns can impact the efficiency and quality of transit service. So if this is a transit corridor, you can see if the building orientation, if the design, if the pedestrian infrastructure is in place, the transit service can operate on the main corridor without diverting, which adds travel time and expense for everyone. One of the key resources included in the guide that I hope is helpful to all of you is the model ordinance language. There's model ordinance language for both zoning and subdivision and land development, or SALDO. The model ordinance language includes clear definitions of common elements of bus stops. This is one of the most important things, especially if you want to start asking developers to help with providing bus stop infrastructure, is that you have clear definitions so everyone is talking kind of the same language about the potential improvements. The model ordinance also provides guidance related to the location and design of bus stops. An important one, requiring coordination with transit agencies. They're an important part of the planning process. And it includes some specific design guidelines and requirements for bus stop infrastructure, including ADA loading pads, bus shelters, benches, and signs. So the model ordinance language is a great starting point, but it will need to be modified and tailored to the specific needs of each community. We have heard that some municipalities have already incorporated some of this language into draft SALDOs in particular. I believe Lower Merion Township and Susquehanna Township have incorporated and utilized this model ordinance language as a starting point for their SALDO updates. The guide also includes a plan review checklist, and this can be used by municipalities or designers or others to evaluate whether you should be considering a bus stop and if the design plans include appropriate infrastructure. And I'm also going to share in the chat some links to SEPTA's Transit Supportive Community Development Initiative page, as well as the checklist that SEPTA has developed. It was based on the checklist in the Building Better Bus Stops guide and can be used specifically within SEPTA's service area. And it's a great resource for municipalities as well as designers. So I often hear people say, well, it's great to have plans, but we really want to see improvements. We want to get something done. How do we implement bus stop improvements? And the guide provides a couple of different strategies and resources for implementation. First and foremost, one of the most cost-efficient and effective ways is to simply incorporate bus stop improvements as part of other related projects. It may be a transportation improvement project that's being led by the municipality or PennDOT, and the PennDOT Connects process is a great opportunity to start the dialogue on what transit infrastructure may be needed and appropriate and can be incorporated into a transportation improvement project. Additionally, land development projects can incorporate bus stop improvements. The top image is a bus shelter that was installed, I believe, in the Phoenixville area. And it was installed as part of an adjacent land development at no cost to the municipality or the transit agency. In addition, there are a number of opportunities for public-private partnerships. Some transit agencies and municipalities have agreements with vendors such as advertising agencies to provide bus stops through public-private partnerships. And the bottom image highlights another example, and this was a shelter donated by a local Rotary Club, but the municipality agreed to maintain it. There are a number of federal, state, and private grants available for the design and construction of bus stops. I note one here, the AARP Community Challenge Grant is available now. And if you look at previous awards, there are a number of awards they've made in the past for bus stop improvements. So that is an eligible activity under that grant. So before I segue into the design resources, I will ask if Mark, if you have anything you want to add related to SEPTA's community development initiative.
I mean, I think it's we drew on the resources that came out of the Better Bus Stop resource guide, and added a few things and kind of customized the document for our purposes to be able to go out and evaluate a particular location. But you're right about Lower Merion. They did actively use the Saldo information, and I think that's an area where this document, even within the SEPTA area, took the work that we've done and took it to another level, because ultimately partnerships, as you mentioned, Natasha, are very important, and getting the things into the design early in the process is very important. So I don't really have anything else to add other than to say kudos.
Yeah, well, and kudos to Mark for being the bus stop improvement proponent within SEPTA and handling a lot of bus stop related issues. And whenever he and I talk, it's always much more complicated than you first think. So they're not easy, as I said. So now let's talk about some of the design resources. So this is part 2 of the guide. This part is geared more towards transit agencies, PennDOT's PennDOT engineers, as well as municipalities. Something to stress is that bus stop designs should be developed through coordination with public transit agency, the owner of the roadway, and possibly the adjacent property owner. So you can't do these designs in a vacuum. Bus stop design directly impacts public transportation riders in terms of accessibility and safety and comfort and convenience. But the design also impacts the quality, efficiency, and cost effectiveness of the public transportation operations. Since each bus stop is unique, the design has to be based on the specific context, the potential users, the roadway, on roadside features, and the land use context. So while this guide, and you'll see some images included in the guide that show example bus stops, really those are just kind of a starting point and to give and generate ideas. Each bus stop design is unique. So the guide includes some high-level steps for planning and designing a bus stop. And the need for either a new or improved stop can come because there is a transportation improvement project nearby, or a nearby land development, or it may be a community request, or it may be something that, for example, Chester County has identified high ridership stop locations within the county. So once that need is identified, the next step is to evaluate whether you need any improvements, what improvements are feasible, and that requires coordination with the transit agency. I want to note that even if the transit agency says, we can't serve that warehouse now, there might be reason to still incorporate some transit related infrastructure into the plan, whether it's a transportation improvement plan or land development plan. It could be, reserving right of way or providing some pedestrian infrastructure so that it is possible to serve a location or provide transit in the future. But if it is agreed upon by the parties, and particularly the transit agency, that the bus stop improvement is warranted and is a good approach, the next step is to move into design. And that includes looking at the placement and configuration of the bus stop, some of the bus stop key elements, as well as the permits and approvals that may be needed both to install and maintain the infrastructure. The guide touches on evaluating potential bus stop locations, and there are a lot of factors to consider. So the guide includes a number of questions to ask yourself as you're looking at potential bus stop locations. I will emphasize here, it's important to note that bus stops are like shoes and they come in pairs. So while a lot of the graphics that you'll see in the guide and in the presentation show one bus stop, it's really important that as planners and engineers, you think not only about the one bus stop that you might be looking at, but about the adjoining bus stop. Because if someone is getting on or off the bus, they're likely making a return trip and will need to cross the street and access the paired bus stop. There are a number of other siting and design considerations for bus stop locations. For the guide, we based it on 40-foot vehicle, which is the most common size. But again, this is a reason to coordinate with the transit agencies to understand what is the size of vehicle that might be servicing the area and how that needs to be incorporated into the design of the bus stop improvements. The resource guide also provides information on best practices for everything from driveways and sight distance to pavement markings and traffic signals. So now let's talk about some of the bus stop design basics. First is bus stop placement, and this refers to where the bus stop is located with respect to the intersection. There's 3 basic locations along the roadway. One is the far side, which is after proceeding through an intersection. The other is near side, which is before the intersection, and mid-block is between. Far side stops are generally preferred by transit agencies because they minimize the potential conflicts between the bus and vehicles and also provide for kind of safer pedestrian access. Near side stops may be appropriate at key transit generators or where the bus is making a right turn. Mid-block are typically only encouraged where the feasibility of a near side or far side location where that's not possible. And one of the reasons is mid-block stops are a challenge because they need to be paired. And so you have to think about how someone getting on or off the bus at that location would be able to make their return trip. So once you kind of know where the bus stop might be located, you can think about the potential configuration. The configuration impacts how riders get on and off the bus and how the bus integrates with the roadway, the streetscape, and the surrounding environment. So roadside or curbside stops are ones located along the road and typically don't require modification to the curb. These are by far the most common type of stops. And some of the key considerations for roadside stops include the available curb length without obstructions, pedestrian and ADA access, and traffic volumes and speeds. Think of yourself as an operator having to pull the bus to the curb to allow passengers to get on or off and being able to re-enter traffic and do that all safely. Curb extensions or bus bulbs have an extension of the curb line and a wider sidewalk area. And you can see as in the picture in the center, this provides some space for some additional transit amenities such as a shelter. However, curb extensions can require the bus to stop in the travel lane, so that can impact traffic operations. Finally, I'll mention bus bays or pullouts, also called turnouts, and they are a designated area for the bus that doesn't block the travel lane. This configuration is typically used on roadways with higher volumes or speeds, or where the bus may have to have a longer dwell time, possibly a layover related to the schedule. Some of the concerns with this design are the ability for the bus to re-enter traffic and some of the impacts on parking or sidewalks. I will say in our research, this is one area where there's not great design standards. They're outdated. And so it's an area for research that PennDOT is actively trying to get funding from national resources to develop better design standards for bus bays. So now we're going to talk about what are the basic elements of the bus stop. So, you know where the bus stop is located, how it relates to an intersection, what the curb line and how it relates to the roadway and traffic. So now we're going to kind of look on the roadside and what are some of the basic bus stop elements. I'm going to go through each of these elements in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to start with the ADA loading pad, which is one of the key fundamental elements of an ADA compliant bus stop. The ADA loading pad is a firm and stable surface. It's typically concrete. It's not typically different colored. You might not even recognize it because it just looks like sidewalk. But it is a clear area that's at least 8 feet wide, measured perpendicular to the road, and 5 feet measured parallel to the road. And a wider pad can be provided and is desirable. Again, think of yourself as the bus stop operator trying to pull a large transit vehicle with passengers to the curb and having to get that front door directly aligned at the ADA loading pad. So you can see how a wider loading pad can be desirable. So one thing that's important, again, this comes back to definitions and the importance of terminology. An ADA loading pad is not an ADA curb ramp. So in the images on the bottom of the screen where you see the transit vehicles have a ramp that can be deployed. And it's important that when the ramp is deployed, this slope of that ramp allows passengers with mobility needs to easily access the bus. So the goal is to provide, desire is to provide a curb height free, stable area for the deployment of the ramp from the transit vehicle. In the picture on the right that shows a depressed curb and an ADA curb ramp at the bus stop location, you can see how this has the opposite effect. A ramp deployed from the transit vehicle will not necessarily meet the ADA requirements for slope. So here's I show this picture because I think the designer had great intentions. And it's really important that we all become more familiar with the terminology and the requirements associated with bus stops.
Can I jump in on that for a second?
Yeah.
I think that the issue is that the ADA curb ramp provides the access for the pedestrians to the adjacent uses, but it is not intended to be access to the vehicle itself.
Great point, because ADA curb ramps at crosswalks are an important part of the access to and from bus stops. So just a little bit more on the ADA loading pad, because I think it is really important to understand, how it can be done, and it can be fairly simple. So this shows 2 different configurations depending upon if there's a buffer area, a grass buffer area between the curb and sidewalk or not. And again, this is not something that's any more than a sidewalk. And this is one of the key elements of an ADA compliant bus stop. So another fundamental element, and probably one we all recognize the most, is an informational sign. The sign that says the bus stops here and which routes are served. And this is typically provided by the transit agency. There are a number of amenities that can be provided at a bus stop depending upon the land use context, the ridership, and a variety of other considerations. And the guide includes some design guidelines for shelters, benches, and other amenities. It's important to think about, for a shelter in particular, how people will access the shelter and get between the shelter and the ADA loading pad through an accessible route. And it's also important to think about ongoing maintenance, which is an issue I'll touch on later. So this highlights the need for that ADA compliant route accessible route between the loading pad and the shelter, highlighted in this area as the red. It's also important to think, most times your bus stop is part of your streetscape, and you have to think about how the bus stop relates to the broader streetscape, and maintaining a pedestrian accessible route through the stop area, and that should be at least 5 feet wide with a minimum clear width of 4 feet. Something that's become a little bit more, I think, important, I've heard from transit agencies during the pandemic, is use of the rear door. And so while we focus a lot on the front door and providing that ADA access at the front door, many riders use the back door, and they don't want to get off and be in the middle of a tree or a whole bunch of signs. So planning for a clear area at the rear door that's free from obstructions is also important. For a curbside stop, thinking about parking is really important. Again, remembering the ADA and the transit operator, if they're going to pull the bus to the curb and deploy a ramp, they have to be able to get to the curb, and parked vehicles can prevent that from happening. And this is a key role for municipalities to play in helping to make bus stops accessible, and also to support transit overall, is making sure that no parking designation is clear and it's maintained, whether that's with signs or curbs or other pavement markings. A number of bus stop designs, you have to consider how it relates to crosswalks. And the guide includes a recommendation for a minimum 10-foot wide safety buffer between the end of the bus stop zone and a crosswalk, driveway, or an intersection. You want to make sure that the bus doesn't have its rear in the middle of the intersection or blocking a driveway if possible. Municipalities and other partners may also be interested in providing additional amenities at a bus stop. It could include benches, bicycle parking, trash receptacles, lighting. It's important to think about how these amenities don't negatively impact other bus stop features and design and operations. So again, you don't want a trash receptacle placed where the rear door access is. But I think also here, it's important to think that bus stop infrastructure can serve more than just the purpose of providing safe access for transit riders. They can be a community asset, a gathering place. The image on this slide is from York, where they installed a play bus stop. So playground equipment was installed as part of the bus stop infrastructure, and they got a grant to do it. And it makes for not only an asset for the transit riders, but also for families and the community. So it's time, bus stops are a great opportunity to think creatively. When you're planning and designing a bus stop up front, you have to think about what permissions and agreements you need and about long-term maintenance. So there should be a written agreement between responsible parties to maintain, a standalone ADA pad, a bench, a trash receptacle, or a bus shelter. PennDOT does require a transit shelter agreement for any bus stop infrastructure in the state right-of-way. The other item is that bus stop infrastructure can require some routine and ongoing maintenance, such as emptying trash cans or removing graffiti. And there may be at times for more significant repairs, such as replacing a bench or a shelter. The maintenance can be an opportunity for partnerships between different entities. And so you can think about maybe having one entity install the infrastructure and another entity responsible for ongoing maintenance. I will note here, and I'm sure Mark will reiterate this, that SEPTA does not typically own bus shelters. And so that is something that the bus shelter is a piece of the infrastructure that is usually taken on by the municipality in partnership with adjacent land owners and or advertising agencies. So with that, I'll get into part 3, which is the last part of the design, the resource guide. And this, it presents bus stop typologies, 8 bus stop renderings and notes for typical bus stop treatments. The typologies reflect different community contexts and different levels of supportive infrastructure. So I want to reiterate here that not every bus stop needs a shelter. Sometimes a shelter doesn't make sense. So it's important that you think about the context and the community and the needs of the transit rider when you're developing the design. While the bus stop typologies don't cover every type of bus stop and all aspects of design, they highlight some of the common elements and some of the design considerations. Again, I'll reiterate that any bus stop design should be done in coordination with the transit agency, as well as the roadway owner, such as PennDOT and the municipality. So I'm going to go through a couple of the typologies and highlight some of the things that might be of interest. First is a rural or suburban stop with a street level ADA loading pad. So think of your typical rural stop, which is currently a sign maybe on a steep embankment on the side of a road. The idea here is to provide an ADA loading pad, an area for passengers to board and alight the bus, and then access to the public right-of-way, which in this case is the roadway. So it's a little bit hard to see or visualize in this plan view. So we do have a 3D view and also a sample image that shows how you can provide, again, a level stable surface for the ADA loading pad. And you can see how this is a relatively simple design, but really makes the bus stop to be a place within the community. As I mentioned, because of the ADA requirements and the ramp being deployed from the vehicle, it's desirable to have that ADA loading pad at curb height. So this is, again, a rural or suburban stop with a curb height ADA loading pad. And you'll see if you have the curb height ADA loading pad, you need to provide a ramp and then a landing area for access to the public right-of-way, which again, in this case, is the roadway. Here's a 3D view of the curb height ADA loading pad, and you can see the example image as well. So, while it's desirable to provide sidewalk connections everywhere, we know that's not possible, which is one of the reasons we show those rural and suburban stops with isolated ADA loading pads. But even better than that is to provide a sidewalk connection to the nearby generators. This is an example that may be a commercial driveway. You can imagine this could be an office building. It could be a fast food driveway. It could be a retail shopping center. I think it's really important to think about how you can provide at least a sidewalk from the bus stop to the driveway, and even more ideally, provide pedestrian infrastructure and connections to the front door. This is an urban or suburban stop, which is far side, and this is a really probably typical bus stop configuration. You can see the ADA loading pad is just integrated with the sidewalk. The number 3 there is kind of the buffer area or clear zone, and that can either be paved or it can be grass. And it's important. I will note you see the 90 feet is a fairly lengthy or long bus stop zone. That is what's recommended, but many transit agencies through coordination will accept a shorter bus stop zone. This is an urban or suburban stop that's near side, and it shows some enhancements. So it has pedestrian lighting, it has a shelter, a bicycle rack, as well as a curb extension. And lastly, the guide does go into some detail for suburban stops, which may be within a site. So in general, the transit agencies do not want to deviate from their primary bus route. But in some situations, it warrants deviation to serve a key transit generator. And there are a number of considerations for how the bus both circulates within that site and also providing bus stop facilities within that site, making sure that you're not conflicting with high traffic areas at the front door, but that you are providing pedestrian access and connections between the bus stop and the front door. There's a lot of great information in the guide about stops within a site. And, again, the development here could be a warehouse, it could be a shopping center, it could be a multifamily housing development. So there are a number of different transit generators which may warrant considering diversion and a stop within a site. So key takeaways. I hope this provides a great summary of what you should remember as you get ready to build better bus stops. One is proactive planning. I think the best thing that we can all do is start to think about and incorporate transit upfront in all of our plans. And I hope that the model ordinance language and the checklist are great tools and a starting foundation for that proactive planning process. I've emphasized that bus stops are complex. They're not easy. So if you're going to tackle one, start small, start easy. Pick one stop in your community or pick a handful of stops. And I think this is the strategy Chester County has taken in identifying some high ridership stop locations where bus stop shelters and amenities might be warranted. It's important to build strategic partnerships along the way. And I think in Chester County, you have a lot of the representatives from those key agencies on this call, including TMAC, the county, SEPTA, and others. And continue to seek opportunities to integrate the improvements within existing projects. So with that, I'm amazed and impressed that I'm done on time, Tim.
Thank you, Natasha. That was great. And your backup crew there, Mark Castle, he did a great job in answering questions that we did have in the chat area. And just to kind of follow up with some of them in case you have some additional information because your work across the state, we had, is there a sample maintenance agreement that might take into account some sort of private partnership? Mark did comment on and gave an example of something that they had worked through in another township, but have you seen any of that work?
Through working with other transit agencies, I know that they, I'll use Lanta, for example, in the Lehigh Valley, they have bus shelter maintenance agreements, I believe, with some of the municipalities where they operate. So sometimes maintenance is part of an overall shelter agreement. But I don't have any specific examples of a maintenance agreement.
But since the majority of our folks here, that conversation is always started with on the SEPTA side of the house, since they are the authority that serves the transit agency in Chester County and in Montgomery County too.
Yeah, the example that I cited in the chat was one that just recently came up in West Goshen, where a private developer was interested in putting in a shelter. PennDOT requires the township to be the permittee, but there was a relationship developed with the developer as part of the land development process. But I don't have the specific language of that. You'd have to reach out to the township for that information.
So are there any other questions from folks that have joined us today? If so, put them in the chat. So Mark, can what are some of the things that you're working on today, in the transit territory here in Chester County?
Well, one of the things related to bus stops in particular, I would stress again, is the idea of partnerships. There's nothing in the municipality's planning code that requires the transit agency to be engaged. So we rely on the good graces of folks like Mark Gallant at the Chester County Planning Commission, who I see on the call, to highlight issues that might come up in their reviews. Certainly engaging municipalities in their planning commission work, and we try to do as much outreach as possible in that regard, but we also have hundreds of municipalities that we deal with. This is really still very much an emerging process. And I know even through conversations that we've had with Natasha in regards to the implementation of the resource guide, that new areas of concern and of further study have come up. And there are legal issues, there are public relationship issues. People want bus stops in their community because it's a sign of investment. It's a sign that we're providing choices for people. But at the same time, there's so much context sensitivity around them. So we have to work through those things. And so even within our own internal processes, we're looking more critically on, what qualifies as an acceptable bus stop. And do we need to look at it in the context of our bus revolution project? Because we may be making changes to bus stops. We may be making changes to routings. We may be making changes to what types of vehicles we use in a particular setting. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and not to scare people off, but the idea is talk to us, get us involved where you think it's appropriate.
Thank you, Mark. We do have a comment in here from Nate. Is there any mapping data available regarding existing locations, quality, ranking of needs? Is that something that you have, Mark? And Gallant on that one?
We have locational information that's available through our GIS portal, where you can pull in mapping for all the existing bus stops within the system. We don't necessarily prioritize them because they're based on existing conditions that the stop is already there. Whereas, and then there's ridership information that's linked to that. And if people need, kind of more hands-on assistance in that regard, we can work with you on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It sounds familiar. It may be some information that we do have mapped. I can check with our graphics department to see if we do, and if we do, if it's been updated recently.
Great, thank you.
I think, if I'm correct, as part of Chester County's public transportation plan, and Randy can potentially chime in, all of us former Chester County people will scratch our institutional knowledge, but I think as part of that plan, there was a look at ridership and what potential stops might have higher ridership and therefore greater needs for bus stop improvements. And I think the county has advanced that even further and kind of come up with a short list of potential locations for shelters. And they've been coordinating with a number of the municipalities, TMAC and others. So maybe Tim, you could chime in on that county initiative. But to echo Mark's comment, SEPTA's GIS portal always has up-to-date information both on routes and stops. And so that's a good place to start for just knowing where there are bus stops.
Are there any other questions that are floating out there? I do have.
I'll put the link to the GIS portal in the chat.
Okay, and we'll grab that and put that in the presentation. Thank you, Mark.
I can also, if people encounter other transit agencies across the state, I can put a link in the chat to PennDOT's transit map. And it's a good starting point. It can identify who provides transit service within a county, but then you have to go to that specific transit agency in order to get more information about their route and stop location. So it's not a one-stop shop for where bus stops are in Pennsylvania.
And Randy did drop a comment in the chat. He said, yes, the policy recommendations for the Chesco Transit Plan was greater than 6 boardings per day, and a shelter was recommended. So that's already in that plan. Well, great. Thank you very much, Natasha and Mark, for your input. Natasha, it's always great to learn from you about the projects that you're working across the Commonwealth on and here in Chester County. I know that you are a go-to person for us here at TMAC as we do some planning for Chesco Bus, and we're looking at where the appropriate bus stops may be and kind of thinking about that. And I will say, between you and Mark, I am not a transit planner. I don't pretend to be a transit planner, but I can play one on TV with the knowledge that you have imparted upon me. So I try to use that knowledge for good. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. Hopefully it was insightful for you. We will be packaging this up and putting it into a recorded presentation. The link should be in our Monday morning memo. So if you get that memo, you'll get that, and it will be then posted on our YouTube page where we do have several other of our past programs. So again, if there are no more comments and questions, we are at that magical hour, 12:54, able to do something before you get to that 1 o'clock meeting. So everybody, thank you very much for being with us.